I'm going to start sharing my screen. This is the first in two presentations. The other one focuses on housing applications, which is an important topic for everyone, regardless of the profile of their family member. But tonight is more of an overview. And so we can think of supported housing as a sandwich. And our bottom bun is our affordable or subsidized housing. And the subsidy may be attached to a specific unit, a specific apartment, or it might be a portable voucher, which is used to rent an apartment in the community. Next on our sandwich is anything else funded by the government. This can include services from the Department of Developmental Services, Mass Health. It can include federal benefits such as Social Security and SNAP. Next on our supported housing hamburger are private pay services, and they are our condiments. And obviously we want to go light on these if we can. And then finally, we cap our sandwich off with unpaid support from family and friends. The sandwich applies to everyone. And obviously, the more we can maximize that bottom bun and the burger, the less we have to rely on the private pay and on the unpaid support from family and friends. Now, the good news is that separation of housing from services is best practice. Most people are actually going to have to find or create housing. And, that can be daunting, but it can lead to better outcomes. For one thing, people get to choose who they live with. If you are living in a DDS licensed group home, you don't really have any choice over who your housemate is. Similarly, if you are controlling the property in some way and you don't like the provider agency you're working with, you can change providers without the individual having to move. And then similarly, if a live-in caregiver quits, the caregiver leaves, not the person with a disability. So we can look at this as a 5 to 10 year roadmap. And the first stop on the roadmap is assessing skills and supports. And the main reason that this is the first stop on the roadmap is that you can do it before the individual turns before the individual turns 18. Many of the other things you can't do until they turn 18. So assessing skills and supports is identifying the skills your family member has already, which I call bucket 1, the skills you think they can acquire, which I call bucket 2, the ones they will always need some help with, bucket 3, and the ones they will need to have done for them, bucket 4. Now, once they turn 18, you can start to get the individual on appropriate housing waiting lists. You can't do that before they turn 18. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of doing this for everybody. Even somebody living in a DDS licensed group home can use a portable housing voucher. And it will improve the status of the budget of their group home. So this really applies to everyone. The third stop is applying for other government benefits, whether that's DDS, Department of Developmental Services, Social Security, etc. Once somebody is 22, for example, they can apply for food stamps on the basis of their own income, even if they're still living with mom and dad. So that's stop number 3, applying for benefits. Stop number 4 is what we're doing while we're on this long, slow wait for some form of affordable or subsidized housing. And while we're on this long, slow wait, we go back and we look at our 4 buckets of skills. And remember, our first bucket is the skills we already have and actively use. The second bucket is the skills we think the person can learn. And so while we are waiting, we are moving as many skills from bucket 2 into bucket 1 as possible. And then For buckets 3 and 4, the skills they will need some help with, or the skills that will need to be done for them, we figure out what our supportive systems are going to be, and we practice them. And the goal is that when the person has their housing subsidy and they move in somewhere, ideally what we should be doing is generalizing, because our goal is to do a shakedown cruise. We do not want to be building the plane while flying it. All right, so we're not going to panic. We're going to plan. Again, 5 to 10 years is not uncommon. We start taking our concrete steps at 18, and we don't wait until it's time to move out, because when the family starts taking steps is when that 5 to 10 year clock starts. We're going to talk about what I call the housing equation, which is the rules that govern which government programs can be combined, which cannot be combined, what they can be used for, and where they can be used. Developing assets, ideally before the person is 18, if possible, aka saving money. Never in the person's name, although the person can be the beneficiary of an ABLE account or a special needs trust, and we'll talk more about that later. This is a good place for me to say that nothing here constitutes legal, financial, or real estate advice. And then finally, develop the person's daily living skills. This will reduce the need for paid support, and build a circle of support around the person, because mom and dad won't live forever. This slide is our menu for the rest of the evening. If we run short on time, we may need to skip the final 2 bullet points, but or actually we may need to skip some of the assets and the circle of supports, but you will receive a copy of the slide, so it should all be there. Okay, I mean, the copy of the slides, plural. So the housing equation is our bricks and mortar expenses, in other words, our housing expenses, plus food, plus supportive services is our bare bones housing. And remember, this does not include spending money, transportation, what the person does during the day. And even in Eastern Massachusetts, where housing is incredibly expensive, supportive services still almost always cost more than the housing expenses. And we can understand why this is if we remember that there are not 40 hours in a week, there are 168 hours in a week. And if your family member needs some form of support or supervision 24/7, that's going to add up really quickly. Even if you're just paying one person $10 an hour, that's $1,680 a week. And obviously, we're not paying one person $10 an hour. We're doing a lot more than that. And that's where the importance of accessing these government services comes in. Now, we have now added under each one of our elements in the housing equation a column. And the column is, each column is comprised of governmental funding streams, with the rear being brought up with private resources, our own money. And you can see that some of these governmental funding streams appear in all 3 columns, and they are in blue boxes. Some things only appear in 1 column. If something appears in a column, you can use it for that purpose. So, for example, SSI appears in all 3 columns, but Section 8 only appears in the housing column. SNAP, food stamps, only appears in the food column, and Mass Health, Medicaid, only appears in the supportive services column. So let's start with our cash benefits. And cash benefits can be used for housing, food, or services. And the first one I'm going to talk about is SSI, which stands for Supplemental Security Income. Believe it or not, the SS does not stand for Social Security. It stands for Supplemental Security Income. And to be eligible for SSI, someone has to be elderly, blind, or disabled. And don't ask me why they distinguish blind from disabled, but they do. Extremely low income, and no more than $2,000 in assets. And the amount that it pays depends on the person's living situation. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But the first thing I want to mention is that the SSI payment comes in two parts. There is what is called the federal portion of the benefit, and then there is what is called the Massachusetts State Supplement. And the two of them together make up the SSI payment. Now, the lowest end, the maximum payment is, you might say, what is a lowest maximum payment? The maximum payment you can get in the living situation where the person is in the household of another, for example, living with mom and dad, is $716 a month. The highest end is $1,397 a month, and that would be a person living in an assisted living facility. The two in between are a situation where a person is sharing expenses equally with housemates, or they're in a licensed group home, and that's $973 a month in 2024. And then if a person is living in their own apartment without anyone helping them to pay the rent other than, for example, a housing voucher, the maximum amount is $1,397, or sorry, is $1,057, excuse me, $1,057 a month. Why is this the maximum? It's the maximum because if the person has any income from any source above $85 a month, it's going to reduce the benefit. And it's going to reduce the benefit by 50 cents on the dollar, up to a maximum of 1/3 of the federal portion of the benefit plus $20. Let me repeat that, up to 1/3 of the federal portion of the benefit plus $20. So that includes any earned income the person has, and it also includes any unearned income. In other words, money from mom and dad, for example. So this is very confusing, so let's use an example. Johnny has a job at Stop and Shop collecting grocery carts. And Johnny makes $100 a month at his job. And so that is in addition to what he gets from SSI. Because he makes $100 a month, he is $15 over the cutoff. And so what happens is he has to report that amount every month. And the next month, his benefit is reduced by $7.50 because $7.50 is half of $15. Now, there's a point at which they stop reducing it, and that point is 1/3 of the federal portion of the benefit plus $20, which is about $300, give or take. And that is looking at a combination of earned and unearned income. Obviously, if Johnny makes a ton of money, he may work himself off Social Security altogether. Now, a great thing about SSI is a person who is receiving SSI on the basis of their own income as an adult is automatically eligible for Mass Health Standard. And Mass Health Standard is what we call Medicaid in Massachusetts. Anytime you hear Mass Health, you should hear Medicaid. And it's really important to be clear whether you're on Medicaid or Medicare or a combination. And the reason it's important is because they can be used for different things. Medicaid pays for long-term services and supports. If you've ever had an elderly parent go into a nursing home, you may have been shocked to discover that Medicare doesn't pay for the nursing home after a certain number of days. And that's because the nursing home is a long-term service and support, and Medicaid, not Medicare, pays for long-term services and supports. So that's why at that point, the elder needs to spend down their assets until they qualify for Medicaid, at which point Medicaid can start to pick up the nursing home. It is similar with our family members, although, they're not living in nursing homes, they still need to be able to tap into long-term services and supports. Now, if your person gets on SSI at 18, very shortly, as in a few weeks, they should receive a Mass Health card in the mail. If they don't, you're going to need to call Mass Health and say, hey, where is my family member's card? If the person on the other end of the phone says they need to apply for Mass Health, you need to say, no, they are 18 and they are on SSI, so they qualify for Mass Health automatically. If they continue to give you trouble, ask to speak with the supervisor. And SSDI, moving right along, stands for Social Security Disability Insurance. And I want to draw your attention to the word insurance. Insurance is something where, if you need to collect on it, benefit is paid out because of money that you paid in. Well, how do we pay in SSDI? We pay in through those payroll tax deductions on our paycheck. And so what this tells us is that SSDI is based on a work history. Only a work history can qualify someone for SSDI because it's really an insurance program. And it can be based on the individual's work history if they have worked enough Social Security quarters, or it can be based on the parent's work history. And so for some understanding of this, let's go back to Johnny and the shopping carts. After Johnny has worked enough Social Security quarters and earned enough, he may start to get a small SSDI check based on his own work history. That does not make his SSI go away, but it does reduce his SSI by the amount of his SSDI. So that he's still getting the same amount of money, but it's now coming from two sources, some from SSI, some from SSDI. Now, let's say a few years go by and one of Johnny's parents retires and starts to draw Social Security. When they go through the retirement process with Social Security, part of that process is they get asked, do you have a disabled adult child? And a disabled adult child is defined as someone with a permanent disability present before the age of 22. And so if the parent checks off that box, what will now happen is that Johnny's going to start to get SSDI based on the parent's work history, and his SSDI benefit will be set equal to 50% of the parent's retirement benefit. It does not reduce the parent's retirement benefit. It doesn't come out of it. It's just set equal to that amount. And Johnny can continue to receive that amount for the rest of his life. And when the parent dies, that amount is actually going to go up to 75%. And then Johnny can keep, at that higher level for the rest of his life. So you can see that this can change over time. If the amount of the SSDI from the parent's work history is big enough to be greater than Johnny's maximum SSI benefit, SSI goes away completely and Johnny just has SSDI. If it's still a little bit less, Johnny keeps a little bit of SSI. Now, let's say a few more years pass and another parent retires and that parent has a stronger work history. Now Johnny's SSDI benefit is going to change to be set equal to 50% of that parent's work history. And again, when that parent dies, it can go up to 75% and Johnny can keep that for the rest of his life. Great, right? So far, so good. Especially since, in some circumstances, you don't have the $2,000 asset limit if you're on SSDI. And there's also no limit on the unearned income your family can give you. But there is a limit on how much the recipient can earn. And that's what's called substantial gainful activity. And in 2024, it's $1,550 a month. And so I want to suggest that you be careful. It is not uncommon for me to see somebody who is, for example, making or receiving, I should say receiving $1,300 a month of SSDI as a disabled adult child because a parent has retired. And they also have $1,200 a month in earned income. So they've got income of $2,500 a month. Now they get offered a raise at work that's going to take, the person consistently up to, say, $1,600 a month, which is above the SGA. If the person takes that promotion and does this for long enough, they can permanently lose their disabled adult child benefit. And now their income will have dropped from $2,500 a month to $1,600 a month. So unless you are absolutely sure that the person can work their way through the gap and get up to the point where their earned income is as great as they were receiving as a combination of SSDI and earned income, be very careful about whether you take that promotion. And part of the reason I say be very, very careful is that I see a lot of people who are very successful working 20 to 25 hours a week, but when they start to work 30 hours a week or more, they wind up getting fired. And so that's why you need to be careful. The good news is it's not an absolute cliff. It doesn't happen all at once. There is a phased process, but you still need to pay attention to what's going on. Now, one thing to know about SSDI is after the person has been on it for 2 years, they start to receive Medicare. And the good thing about receiving Medicare is that more doctors take Medicare. It's a very good medical, insurance program, but you cannot use it for long-term services and supports. But the good news is if the person was already receiving Mass Health, SSI and Mass Health on the basis of their own income prior to receiving SSDI, in other words, after they turned 18, and prior to receiving SSDI, they don't lose their Medicaid. They don't lose their Mass Health just because they start to receive Medicare and SSDI. Instead, they can get both of them. They become what is called a dual eligible. And so to use an example, let's say that we've got a situation where an individual still has private health insurance through a parent, for example, and they've also got Medicare and they've got Mass Health. Any bill that comes in first goes to the private insurance. What the private insurance doesn't pay for is then submitted to Medicare. And anything left after Medicare pays its bit gets submitted to Mass Health. All right, now the last thing, one more thing about Social Security and Mass Health is that it used to be that if an individual had too much income and we're not in this process of just becoming a dual eligible and moving from SSI to SSDI, that they could lose their eligibility for Mass Health, and this was a problem. The good news is there's this thing called Common Health, and Common Health is designed to be for people with disabilities who need long-term services and supports to be able to access them, even though their income is higher. And prior to 2023, to be able to tap into Common Health as an adult, an individual had to work 40 hours a month or there had to be a one-time spend down. But that requirement went away in 2023. And so now if somebody has a disability and their income is above 133% of the federal poverty limit, they can automatically qualify for Mass Health, for Common Health. But they may need to pay a sliding scale premium based on their income. Now, the last thing I want to talk about on this slide is something called EAEDC, which is Emergency Aid to Elderly, Disabled, and Children. And it is a Massachusetts-only cash benefit for people, including lawfully present non-citizens, who have been turned down for SSI or SSDI and have housing expenses. So for example, I know someone who has this because they were turned down for SSI and SSDI. They're going to be applying again, but they were turned down for it. And they have a Section 8 voucher and live in an apartment. Well, because they have housing expenses and they've been turned down, they were able to tap into this EAEDC. It is not a big benefit. It maxes out at, I think, $401 a month, but it can still be very important. This slide usually generates a lot of questions. So with everybody's patience, I'm going to stop the share a moment and check on questions now so they don't build up. There's a couple of slides where I will do this.
Cathy, we have one in the chat.
Okay.
Okay.
I believe it's based on the date the parent takes it. Yes.
So I'll read the question.
Yes, good idea.
For retirement and SSDI benefits, is retirement based on the date the parent takes SS or Social Security benefits?
One other thing that has not been asked, but I'm going to mention because it frequently comes up, is if the parent is someone who is never going to receive Social Security benefits, say because they're on a pension plan as a retired local government employee or a railroad pension or whatever, the child cannot be a disabled adult child. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. All right, now, Mass Health. Mass Health must be used for services. And Mass Health comes in two varieties. There's what is called Mass Health Waiver Services, which I'm by and large not going to be talking about. But then there is also something called Mass Health State Plan Services, which is what I'm going to talk about now. Mass Health State Plan Services are an entitlement, meaning if you meet the criteria, you are supposed to get it and there is not supposed to be a waiting list. Whereas waiver services can have a cap on the number of people who receive them. And because entitlements are very rare in adult services, these Mass Health State Plan Services are very important. And I'm going to talk about three of them. There are other Mass Health State Plan Services, but because they don't relate to housing, I'm not going to talk about them. The three I'm going to talk about are AFC, Personal Care Attendant, or PCA, and Group Adult Foster Care. Now, AFC can stand for either adult family care or adult foster care. In any case, AFC pays a stipend to a caregiver who lives in the same legal unit as the person with the disability and provides care. And if that caregiver is a family member, we call it adult family care. And if that caregiver is not a family member, we call it adult foster care. To qualify for AFC, the person with the disability must need at least prompting for at least one activity of daily living. And an activity of daily living is eating, bathing, dressing, toileting, mobility, transferring in and out of a wheelchair, other hygiene. And this is very narrowly defined. So eating is things like cutting up food. It is not cooking dinner. And we also need to be clear that a prompt is not the same as a reminder. So a reminder is, Anna, go take a shower. And Anna does it, and she does it correctly. A prompt is, Anna, turn the water on. Anna, get your hair wet. Anna, let's get the shampoo, etc. And so if the person needs at least prompting with one activity of daily living, then they can qualify for what is called Level 1 AFC, which pays a stipend of about $27 a day tax-free. If the person needs physical assistance for 3 or more activities of daily living, or for 2, and there is a maladaptive behavior present, such as resisting care, they can qualify for Level 2 AFC, which pays about $53 a day. The provider must live in the same legal unit and cannot be a legal guardian. And so what this means is a person who is living with their parents cannot really qualify for AFC until they turn 18, because the parents are automatically guardians until the person turns 18. At 18, if there is no guardianship, either one of the parents could be an AFC provider. Frequently, what will happen is one parent will become a guardian and another parent will become the AFC caregiver. Is this unfair to single parents? Absolutely. Is there a bill in the legislature to try to change it? Yes. Has there been a bill in the legislature for all 15 years I have been giving this presentation? Yes. However, I am still hoping this is our year. The other thing to be aware of about AFC is that in general, you cannot combine it with food stamps. The only way to combine AFC with food stamps is if the caregiver also qualifies for food stamps. And I know that some people have been told by their AFC agencies they should apply for food stamps. It's incorrect, unfortunately. All I can do is tell you that you're not supposed to be doing that. So the next thing I'm going to mention is personal care attendant services, or PCA. And PCA is a program that was originally designed for people with physical disabilities who need periodic support throughout the day. So I want you to imagine, for example, someone who's a lawyer at a downtown law office in Boston, but they're quadriplegic. So they're going to need help with shaving, showering, getting ready in the morning, getting ready for bed at night, but they're not somebody who needs supervision. And so the way PCA operates is an assessment is done. They divide the day into 15-minute chunks. And they say, how many 15-minute chunks does the person need support for? And they add those up and multiply it by 7 to get a number of hours for the week. And the kind of support we're talking about is the person must need physical assistance for 2 or more activities of daily living. So you can see that a person can qualify for level 2 AFC. They could also qualify for PCA, but guess what? You're not allowed to use both at the same time. You have to pick one. It's possible to move from one program to the other, but you can't combine them. Again, the provider cannot be a guardian. So after 18, a parent who is not a guardian could be a PCA for their family member. The other major distinction between PCA and AFC is that the personal care attendant does not have to live in the same legal unit with the guardian, and that will become important later in our conversation. And then the last one I want to talk about is group adult foster care. And group adult foster care is worth about $1,324 a month. Oh, I forgot to mention PCA is $19 an hour. Group adult foster care is worth about $1,324 a month. The person must need at least prompting for at least one ADL, and it is designed to cover 1 to 2 hours a day of drop-in services. This program was originally created for elderly living in assisted living facilities. And it has been generalized to the population of younger adults with developmental disabilities. But it was originally, again, designed to be a drop-in program for people who are living in some kind of formal housing. And historically, what this meant was that you could only use group adult foster care in assisted living or in subsidized housing where the subsidy was attached to the property, but not the person. And the property was served by a group adult foster care provider. Now, thanks to a great deal of confusion due to the fact that the Office of Elder Services did not ever actually promulgate guidelines until about 2 years ago on this program. There was a lot of confusion about the subsidized housing piece. And what happened was a lot of people didn't realize that you couldn't get GAFC if you had a portable housing voucher. But now that they have finally promulgated regulations, there seems to be much more flexibility around this, but you would still have to be in a location that a group adult foster care provider agrees to serve. And generally speaking, it's a good bet they're going to serve subsidized housing where the subsidy is attached to the building, not the person. One last comment on this slide is that back in about 2015, the U.S. Department of Labor said that people who are providing care need to be receiving the equivalent of minimum wage with time and a half after 40 hours a week. Well, you can see there's absolutely nothing about $27 a day that says time and a half after 40 hours a week, or even minimum wage. But the Department of Labor made an exception if the care was taking place in the home of the caregiver, controlled by the caregiver, but not housing controlled by the person with a disability or their family or a third party, such as a human services agency. So what this did was it resulted in a situation where if a person with a disability moved into somebody's guest room and that person agreed to provide care, Department of Labor didn't worry about minimum wage and time and a half because they said it was a charitable act. On the other hand, if the caregiver moved into the home of the person with the disability, Department of Labor said that was an employment relationship. And this other thing came into play. What this means, unfortunately, is we have created an incentive for a housing model where when the caregiver quits, the person with a disability has to move. This is problematic. And this continues to be problematic, but there are some ways of dealing with it. One is that a caregiver is allowed to care for 3 people at level 1 and 2 people at level 2, and the stipends are additive. Also, the person does not have to be compensated for time when they're asleep, and they don't have to be compensated for time when the person with a disability is away during the day. So there are at least ways to get a handle on it. And similarly, because the same regulation applies to PCA, what happened was Mass Health said, you know what, if you hire a PCA, you have to find out how many hours a week they're working as a PCA, not just for you, but for anybody else. Because we are not in a position to be paying overtime. And so what happened was eventually a bunch of PCAs said, if we can't work 50 hours a week, we're going to have to quit because we can't make a living. And that's when DDS said, okay, people only have to get a waiver if the caregiver is working 50 hours a week. Complicated slide. Again, I'm going to stop the share here for just a moment and see if we have any questions.
This is Allison speaking.
Yep. Christy has a question as well.
Oh, excellent.
You have a minute.
I was going to say, we have none in the chat. We don't have any in the chat.
All right. I'm just going to spotlight her for 1 second.
That's perfect. Thank you.
So my question is regarding PCA services. So 1 second. So the people who come to work as PCAs, you can get a PCA if you're under 18, correct? Can you still get one if you're, I'm sorry, you can get one if you're over 18. Can you get one if you're under 18?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the age doesn't matter for
Right.
awesome. My
Where
other question is,
yeah, you just want to add something to that. Where age does matter with the PCA is the parent can't be the PCA if the person's under 18.
got it. Okay, perfect. I understand that now. That makes sense. So my next question is the ABLE account. So that account, you can do that. I was looking online at the information about the ABLE account. And so my question is, if the disabled person is getting SSI and they have the $2,000 limit, which I understand, then if there's a special account, like an ABLE account, what's the limit for that? Like, is there a limit? Who's watching that?
So you cannot have more than $100,000 in an ABLE account without it affecting government benefits.
Sorry, 100,000?
100,000.
100,000. Where
100,000.
do you find that information? Like, where do you find all the details about an ABLE account and the rules and everything?
www.ablenrc.org. Stands for the ABLE National Resource Center.
ablenrc.org. Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, last question. So the EADC, so is it if parents have a high income and they have a disabled child, that's over 18, sorry, no. They're getting they've been denied for SSI and SSDI, so therefore they may qualify for the EADC. What's that like?
EAEDC has very specific rules. It basically applies to an extremely low income parent caring for a child with a disability who's been turned down for Social Security. It also applies to adults or who have housing expenses and a disability who've been turned down for Social Security. And finally, it applies to people who are homeless, who have a disability, who've been turned down for Social Security.
I see. Okay.
Okay.
Got
And
it.
they make you reapply for Social Security every year.
Got it. Okay. So, and my last question, is the PowerPoint that you're presenting tonight somewhere that is going to be shared or I could get a copy of?
Usually, what I do, and I will do this tonight, I will send a copy to Allison and to Shreya, and they can send it out to anyone who attended who's on their list.
Oh, that's great. Super. I would love that. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Awesome.
So, all right. Now, Section 8. Section 8 is a program of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the Section 8 I'm going to be focused on is what's called tenant-based Section 8. It's also called portable Section 8. It's also called mobile Section 8. It should not be confused with project-based Section 8, which is a Section 8 apartment. This tenant-based Section 8 can be thought of as a coupon that you use to make any old apartment in the community up to a certain amount more affordable. And the way it works is the person pays 30% of their income in rent to the landlord, and the difference between that and the actual rent is paid directly to the landlord with funds from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And that payment is made by the organization that issued the voucher, usually a local housing authority. The great thing about Section 8 is it is not considered a resource or an asset for the purposes of SSI or mass health benefits. The downside is that it can be and often is a 10 to 12-year wait. And how long the wait is depends on where you live. The person can apply based on their own income at 18, but not before. Once a person gets it, they have a minimum of 60 days to use it or lose it. Sometimes it can be more depending on the housing authorities. Some housing authorities will automatically say 90 days. But in any case, you can usually get an extension for a person with a disability, but it is not open-ended. This is not something you could just put in your back pocket and hold on to for 4 years. No, you've got to use it within, probably 3 to 6 months at the maximum. There were a few exceptions during the pandemic, but it was a pandemic. Now, a person with a disability can receive a 2-bedroom voucher if they need an aide to live with them, but the aide cannot be a close family member, not mom, dad, brother, sister. A cousin might be okay. Having a family member be the landlord is normally not permitted, but can be permitted as a reasonable accommodation for disability, but the person renting must live in a legal separate unit. We have a separate website called 18section8.org that has a website to walk families through the process of applying for Section 8 and other affordable and subsidized housing. As you can tell from that, Section 8 is not the only game in town. There are other affordable and subsidized housing options. There is the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, or MRVP, which is can either be a portable voucher, or some communities have site-based MRVP units. There is the Alternative Housing Voucher Program, or AHVP, which is just for people 18 to 59 with disabilities in Massachusetts, also a portable voucher. And the key thing to remember about MRVP and AHVP is that they are funded with state money. Section 8 is funded with federal money. And what that means, if you have a Section 8 voucher, after you've had it for 12 months, you can take it out of state. MRVP and AHVP can never go out of state. In Massachusetts, 13.5% of units in state elderly housing are reserved for adults with disabilities ages 18 to 59. Federally funded elderly housing sometimes, but not always, reserves some units for younger adults with disabilities. It's on a location-by-location basis. There's also project-based family housing, which can be either state funded or federally funded, and federally funded would include project-based Section 8 under that heading. Then there's private affordable housing, And these are the large developers who received tax credits or some other incentive to cause them to set aside a percentage of units at lower price points. So Halkeen Management, Beacon Communities, Peabody Properties, Winco, Avalon, these are all places where you'll find private affordable housing. The private affordable housing can also be a very good place to use a voucher if you have one, because one of the problems with vouchers is that housing is so expensive in Massachusetts that it can be hard to find a place that fits inside the cap. But the private affordable housing for people between 60 and 100% of area median income fits the bill. So it's a good place to use a portable voucher. Then there's single room occupancy. Classic example of this is renting a room at the YMCA. Affordable assisted living might be appropriate for an older adult. And then rest homes, again, older adults, only really affordable if the only income is SSI or EAEDC, but I've seen it come in handy if you've got a situation where, mom and dad are gone and a sibling is trying to prevent homelessness. All right, so again, here I'm going to stop the share, and after this slide, I'm going to go all the way to the end before taking more questions, but I will stop here again.
So Cathy, this is Allison.
Is the Section 8 application a one and done, or do you need to reapply yearly? In addition, how can we check the status of the application to ensure it was A, received, and B, where your individual may be in the line? A very good question, and not one that has a terribly simple answer. So there's more than one Section 8 application. We can think of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, as the voucher fairy that goes around scattering vouchers to different housing authorities. And those housing authorities decide how to run their waiting lists. So there are two major lists people should get on. One of them is what's called the centralized waiting list, which is 102 cities and towns that got together and agreed to share a single list. It is an online application. You are supposed to log in every 90 days. They have the right to throw you off if you don't. They don't always do it, but they can, and sometimes they do. The other major Section 8 application is called the EOHLC, Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program Waiting List. This is a paper application, and you mail it to a nonprofit organization that serves your region. We're going to talk a lot more about this in the next presentation. But, and then finally, of course, there are the other 25 cities and towns that have vouchers that don't participate in the centralized waiting list, who each have their own process. You apply to anyone you're going to apply to once, but again, with the centralized waiting list, log in every 90 days. With the other ones, it's a good idea to phone them once a year and say, is my family member still on the waiting list? Now, they will usually say, yes, they're on the waiting list, or no, they're not on the waiting list. But if you want to know where they are in line, frequently they will say, we can't tell you, or we don't know. Sometimes, especially with smaller housing authorities, they might say, well, they're number 35 right now, but that can change. Or we think it's 2 to 4 more years. And the reason they can't tell you where the person is in line is because housing authorities are allowed to set preferences for different populations. So you might be number one in line, but if your housing authority has a preference for homeless veterans, and a homeless veteran walks in and applies that day, they're going to get the voucher, even though you've been on the list for 10 years. That's why they can't tell you where you are exactly. Okay. When applying for an apartment, can a step parent be on their lease? If a person is considered a natural part of the household, in other words, they're living with them because they are in a family relationship, the housing authority will look at the income and assets of that person in deciding if the household income qualifies and how much the rent is. And that's why it's problematic around having an aide who's a natural part of the household. I have seen one example where a housing authority let a step parent be the aide, but it was really unusual. Okay. I will go back to sharing my screen.
Christy is saying, I have one more question.
Oh, okay. Hold on.
I'll spotlight her.
That's okay. Go ahead.
So this might be a silly question, but I'm just wondering if, what if the president decides to cut these things, or it's just, this just go away? Like the list, or can these things just disappear?
That's a really good question. It's not a silly question at all.
Okay.
So, for example, in the budget of housing authorities is determined by Congress every year. And if there are cuts to the HUD budget, it can impact the number of vouchers available and the ability to pay for vouchers that already exist. So it's not a silly question at all.
Okay, understood.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So we have a housing search and application grid that we're going to take a very deep dive on at our next talk. And we have detailed information on how to apply for housing at our 18 Section 8 website. Make sure you click on other ways to apply for housing. There is a spreadsheet to track your applications in the document library. There are sample completed applications in the document library. And the site dovetails with the housing search and application grid. The grid is color coded, and there is reference to the color coding throughout the website. Okay, I want to go back to our funding streams for a second, and I want to touch on the things we have not talked about. So let me just come out of the slideshow a second so I can see my notes. Food stamps tend to pay about $218 a month for an individual, but they can be as high as $291 a month. As I mentioned earlier, you cannot really combine them with adult foster care and adult family care unless the caregiver also qualifies. There can be a 30% discount on electricity for people on public benefits, but the utility bill must be in the name of the person with a disability. Comcast has an Internet Essentials plan for $9.95 a month for people on public benefits. Additionally, sometimes DDS will pay for utilities not included in the rent for those receiving individual supports. Another thing that is worth mentioning is eligibility for free cell phone service. SafeLink is an example of a provider. If it's for an individual with a disability or the elderly, and you can show there's a safety reason for it, actually, honestly, they just ask, is the person on public benefits? You can get a free cell phone with a certain amount of minutes and data on it. There can only be one per household. Since I originally wrote this slide, they have expanded greatly on the number of minutes available. It's pretty generous at this point. And then finally, DDS individual support hours can be used by people who have their own place to live outside the family home who don't require 24/7 supports. What does that mean? It means that, for example, let's say your family member is living at home with you and DDS says, Johnny only needs 5 hours a week of support. Now, let's say Johnny moves into his own apartment. Johnny, you can say to DDS, you need to reassess this. And DDS turns around and says, whoa, Johnny needs 15 hours a week of support. And so this increase in supports is made possible by the fact that Johnny now has housing. Which is just another reason why it's so important to get on these housing waiting lists. So, what are some ways to acquire property? You could convert a basement or the garage, but you have to be aware of zoning. You could add on an accessory apartment, but you have to be aware of zoning. For a lot of families, their wealth is tied up in the equity in their home. And so creating a housing option really happens when mom and dad downsize. And so an example of that would be selling the house and buying 2 condos. And maybe you clear enough money from the sale of the house that you can pay cash for the condos. Maybe you need a mortgage on one. There is a provision of Fannie Mae mortgage loans that states that if a parent is acquiring housing for an adult child with a disability, the parent can be considered the owner occupier even if they don't live there, which means that that parent can do can do as little as 5% down and get owner occupier interest rates. Similarly, someone might sell the house and buy a 2 or 3 family. And the third unit might be for rental income, which could be important if you're trying to deal with that Department of Labor regulation we talked about. Or maybe 2 families buy together. So mom and dad A are in unit A, mom and dad B are in unit B, and kids A and B are with a caregiver in unit C. A person can, if their income is high enough to qualify for a mortgage, enter a first-time homebuyer lottery. A family might buy a condo or house for their family member, either alone or with other families. So let's talk about some possible housing strategy. Liam applies for an apartment in state senior housing and gets in after 3 years. He uses group adult foster care to pay for 2 hours a day of drop-in services. Anna gets a certain amount from her parents every month, say through her ABLE account, which she combines with her own funds to get an apartment in private affordable housing. Raj gets on the Section 8 waiting list at 18 and waits 10 years for a voucher. When he gets his voucher, his family uses a 0% interest deferred payment loan from the Home Modification Loan Program combined with a home equity loan to convert the garage to an apartment. Raj uses individual support hours from DDS. And oh, by the way, once Raj moves into that apartment, because it's a legal separate unit, his Social Security benefit will go up because now he's living on his own. Ben gets on the Section 8 waiting list at 18, waits 10 years for a voucher. While waiting, his mother is his adult family care provider and his father is his guardian. His mother saves some of the AFC stipend for 10 years, acquiring money for a security deposit, furniture, and appliances. When he gets his voucher, he moves into an apartment, and I really need to change this to say house because there aren't that many 4-bedroom apartments out there, with 2 friends who also receive AFC, and an adult foster care provider moves in with Ben and his friends. Couple of notes here. In this example, the AFC provider is getting 3 stipends and free rent, which is what makes this doable with the Department of Labor regulation. The other thing I want to underline here is that I said security deposit. A voucher pays for this month's rent. It does not pay last month's rent. It does not pay the security deposit. And sometimes, depending on the location, those are calculated on the base of the market rate rent, which means I've seen somebody have to do a GoFundMe when they got a Section 8 voucher because they suddenly had to come up with, over $4,000 in cash. Sue gets on the Section 8 waiting list at 18. Oh, I'm going back into slideshow. Hold on. Gets on the Section 8 waiting list at 18 and waits 10 years for a voucher. While waiting, her mother is her adult family care provider and her father is her guardian. Her mother saves the AFC stipend for 10 years, acquiring $90,000 to use as a down payment. When Sue gets her voucher, her parents buy a condo and she uses the voucher to pay them rent. Her parents use the rent to pay the mortgage. Please note that while her parents can use the rent to pay the mortgage, they cannot use the expectation of the rent to qualify for the mortgage. An adult foster care provider moves in with Sue. Sue's parents retire and Sue moves on to SSDI, increasing her income. Now, on assets, obviously, in a perfect world, we would all have been saving lots of money since our children were small, but I know how that works. And so let's talk about the alternatives. Financial planning. No assets in the person's name, and make sure other families members know this. It's a problem if Great Aunt Rose dies and leaves $9,000 and little Susie loses her PCA eligibility. ABLE accounts. The two main information sources are the Fidelity account for the ABLE accounts in Massachusetts, and the second link is the one we talked about earlier, the ablenationalresourcecenter.org. Special needs trust is a way to save for the benefit of a person with a disability, but they are not actually, the trust is not their asset. It's for their benefit, but it's not their asset. And there are two kinds of special needs trusts. One is a third-party trust, which is funded by people other than the person with a disability, usually parents or grandparents. The other kind is a self-funded special needs trust, which is funded by the person with a disability. And this frequently comes about, for example, because the individual is receiving child support. And the amount of the child support would put them above the $2,000 asset cap. Special needs trusts, you need to be aware of two issues about them, or you need to be aware of an issue that affects both ABLE accounts and self-funded special needs trust. ABLE accounts and self-funded special needs trusts have what is called a clawback provision, which means when the person with a disability dies, if there is any money left in that account, it can be clawed back by Medicaid to reimburse Medicaid for money spent on the individual. Only if Medicaid is fully reimbursed and there's still money left, can it go to a residual heir. Whereas with a third-party special needs trust, any money left in it when the person dies can go to a residual heir immediately. Again, nothing I'm saying here constitutes legal, financial, or real estate advice, but I can tell you you're going to need to talk to a financial planner. You're going to need to talk to a lawyer. For the sake of time, I'm not really going to talk about individual accounts. They are a theoretical possibility, but I've never actually seen anybody use one, and they're really complicated. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip them. More life insurance is often recommended. So what you might see is what's called second to die life insurance. So when the second parent dies, that life insurance flows into the trust, for example, the special needs trust. Frequently, what you're going to see is you will see people create a special needs trust, but not actually put any money in it. And the reason for that is that once you put money into it, it has to file tax returns every year. And the rate, the tax rate on interest in those accounts is higher than the corporate tax rate, which is why people usually wait to fund them until the second parent dies. All right. Now, skills. Adaptive living skills are the single most important predictor of success for adults with autism in midlife. And the link to that study is at the bottom of the slide. And that that study defines success as a combination of employment and contentment. And guess what? The more skills the person has, the less you need to spend on paid support. You'll remember we talked about the buckets. I like to use this thing called the Modified Adolescent Autonomy Checklist. It takes a look at a whole bunch of skills and basically divides them into those 4 buckets. Additionally, on our website, we have some other resources. We have a life skills library playlist on our YouTube channel, which will walk people through skills like loading and unloading a dishwasher, using a washer and dryer, some basic cooking, plunging a toilet. We have a free course on Teachable called A Place of My Own, written at the 8th grade reading level, that addresses the skills needed to get and keep housing. And that has just been completely revised as of 3 weeks ago. We have a section on skills for living, and we have a section on technology. I also want to draw your attention to the Centers for Independent Living. There are 15 of them in Massachusetts. They are run by and for people with disabilities. They are completely outside of the DDS system, so they are just an additional resource you can tap into. I'm just looking at the time. Okay, we're okay so far. Housing strategy should reflect a vision. And there's 2 visions involved. The first is the vision of the person with the disability. And this is what person-centered planning is for. It's a method for your family member to plan a future, and it relies on circles of support to carry out plans. Now, your vision, the parent's vision, is captured in what's called the letter of intent. And this is nitty-gritty information: the doctors, medications, medical history, location of life insurance policy, the will, what are the family members' likes, dislikes, etc. And letter is sort of a misnomer. My son's letter of intent is a 5-inch thick 3-ring binder. So, you can call it a letter if you want, but it's more of the, my son's encyclopedia. So where do you go from here? We have a turning 18 checklist with things to do when your child turns 18 and links on how to get started doing it. If you remember nothing else I said tonight, try to sign up for Section 8. We have a tool called My Benefits Generator to figure out the mass health supports for which your family member might be eligible. It needs revision. It's usable, but just be aware that the dollar amounts mentioned are meant to reflect 133% and 300% of the federal poverty limit. And the dollar amounts listed are what those were in 2014. You can look up the current ones at this link. I'm in the process of trying to get this updated. Develop a saving strategy. And by saving strategy, I mean things like mom saves the AFC stipend. Another example might be, are the grandparents willing to put $5, $10, $15, $20 a month each month into the ABLE account? Similarly, if your child is someone who's between 18 and 22 and they have a vocational placement, they're allowed to earn more money while they're on Social Security in that circumstance, but they're still not allowed to have more than $2,000 in assets. So that's money that can go into an ABLE account. Pursue options to improve your person's living skills. And additionally, we have an infographic of housing models with funding streams on our website. We have a handy cheat sheet for today's presentation called Housing in a Month's Worth of Tweets. And when you're ready to develop a housing strategy, consider participating in our 5-part virtual housing workshop, learning about housing. We do charge for that. We also have free housing workbooks written at the 8th grade, 1st grade, and picture level that are downloadable at the link. And consider person-centered planning. We can offer it as on a fee-for-service basis, strictly related to housing, but I will say it's pretty expensive. So that is it.